Your Honor. Are we really going to let a 19-year-old kid in a thrift store suit play lawyer? This isn't a mock trial at a community college. This is the real world, and his mother is going to prison.
Prosecutor Dana Pierce's voice cut through courtroom 302 like a blade, sharp and mocking, echoing off the marble walls. Your Honor, are we really going to let a 19-year-old kid in a thrift store suit play lawyer? This isn't a mock trial at a community college. This is the real world, and his mother is going to prison. A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery. Elijah Cross stood frozen at the defense table, the heavy stares of the jury burning into his skin like sunlight through a magnifying glass. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples as if a headache had already begun and the day had barely started. They thought it was over before it began. They had no idea this kid was about to rewrite the law. The air inside courtroom 302 of the Cook County Circuit Court was heavy, thick with the scent of polished mahogany, old paper, and a century's worth of quiet desperation soaked into the walls. For 19-year-old Elijah Cross, it felt like the room itself was closing in around him, inch by inch, second by second. He sat at the defense table, his thin frame swallowed by a borrowed suit 2 sizes too large, sleeves bunched at the wrists, shoulders drooping where they should have sat square. His hands gripped the edges of a worn legal pad so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Beside him sat his mother, Sarah Cross. Her hands, calloused from years of double shifts in the hospital laundry room, permanently reddened from bleach and hot water, trembled as they clutched a crumpled tissue. Sarah was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The charge: a complex, high-level conspiracy to commit wire fraud and the embezzlement of over $200,000 from a local community development fund. It was a charge as absurd as it was terrifying. Sarah barely knew how to use an ATM machine, let alone orchestrate a sophisticated digital heist involving spoofed credentials and offshore wire transfers. But the prosecution didn't care about the truth. They cared about a conviction, a clean, fast, headline-friendly conviction. And Sarah Cross was the perfect scapegoat for a corrupt city councilman who needed someone, anyone, to take the fall for his own financial tracks. Leading the charge against her was prosecutor Dana Pierce, a local legend for all the wrong reasons. A shark in a tailored Armani suit, she carried a conviction rate of 98%, a number she'd built through a combination of brilliant courtroom rhetoric, calculated intimidation, and, as whispers in the legal community suggested, a ruthless willingness to bend the rules until they nearly snapped in her hands. She paced the courtroom floor like a predator that had already cornered its prey, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, a rhythmic, terrifying metronome counting down the minutes to Sarah's destruction. Elijah was not a lawyer. He was a 19-year-old college dropout, forced to leave his scholarship program at the University of Chicago, where he'd been studying applied mathematics and formal logic, the moment his mother was arrested and the state froze their meager bank accounts. With no money left for an attorney, Sarah had been assigned a public defender who, buried under a caseload of 200 clients, had urged her to simply take a plea deal. 10 years minimum, behind bars, in exchange for avoiding the risk of trial. Elijah refused to let that happen. Blessed with an eidetic memory and a mind that processed complex systems the way other people processed simple arithmetic, he had spent the last 6 months living essentially in the basement of the local public library. He devoured everything: the federal rules of civil procedure, state statutes, centuries of case law, and the intricate, often contradictory labyrinth of constitutional precedent that most law students spend 3 years merely skimming. Then he filed a petition, not to become his mother's attorney in any conventional sense, but to act as her legal advocate under a rare, archaic provision buried in the state constitution, one that allowed a family member to speak on behalf of a defendant when no adequate counsel could reasonably be secured. Judge Arthur Harrison, a weary man 2 years from a comfortable retirement, peered down from the bench, adjusting his glasses as his gaze moved from the sharp, composed figure of Dana Pierce to the terrified mother and her thin, intense son. "Mr. Cross," Judge Harrison said, his voice laced with something between pity and warning, "I have reviewed your petition. While I admire your filial devotion, the law is not a playground for amateurs. You are facing an incredibly complex web of financial statutes. The prosecution has laid out what appears to be a devastating paper trail. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed in this manner? If you fail, your mother will face the absolute maximum penalty. Elijah swallowed hard. The courtroom had gone dead silent. He could feel the eyes of reporters in the back row, the bailiff's barely concealed disdain, and the unwavering, cutting contempt radiating from Dana Pierce like heat off asphalt. He looked at his mother. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "I am certain, Your Honor," Elijah said, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and found something steadier underneath it. "The truth is not a playground either, sir, and the truth is that my mother is innocent." Dana Pierce let out a short, sharp laugh. "Your Honor, please. We are wasting the court's time. The defendant signed the disbursement forms. We have the IP addresses. We have the financial logs. This boy is going to stand up here and quote Wikipedia at us while his mother tries to dodge a federal mandate." The battle lines were drawn. The system, massive, indifferent, built on decades of institutional momentum, was poised to crush them without even noticing it had done so. But Elijah's eyes narrowed. Behind his nervous exterior, his mind was already running thousands of calculations, cross-referencing every syllable Pierce spoke against the pages of legal code burned permanently into his memory. The gavel fell. The trial had officially begun, and with it, the countdown to a reckoning no one in that room could have predicted. The first 3 days of the trial were, by any honest account, a masterclass in humiliation. Dana Pierce was not content merely to win the case. She wanted to destroy Elijah Cross publicly, to make an example of him, to remind the courtroom that the legal system was an exclusive club that did not tolerate interlopers wandering in off the street. When Elijah attempted to cross-examine the prosecution's star witness, a forensic accountant hired by the city, Pierce objected to nearly every sentence he spoke. "Objection," she snapped, barely glancing up from her notepad. "Counsel is leading the witness." "Objection. Hearsay." "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Cross is completely misapplying the rules of evidence. He's citing a statute that was repealed in 1994. Judge Harrison sustained almost every single one. "Mr. Cross," he warned, rubbing his temples, "you cannot simply read from a textbook and expect it to apply here. The law is nuanced. It requires interpretation, not just recitation." The jury watched with a mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment. Elijah was stumbling, not because his questions lacked structure, but because Pierce kept derailing them with procedural roadblocks she deployed not to uncover the truth, but to suffocate it before it could surface. The mockery reached its peak on the fourth day when Pierce introduced the prosecution's central piece of evidence. Exhibit 42, a series of digital authorization logs allegedly showing Sarah Cross's secure employee ID initiating the fraudulent wire transfers. Elijah stood, hands shaking slightly, holding a stack of printed server logs he'd managed to subpoena weeks earlier. "Your Honor," he began, voice trembling but growing firmer with each word. "I'd like to introduce a motion to suppress Exhibit 42. I've analyzed the metadata from the city's servers. The timestamps on these authorizations do not align with my mother's shift schedule. Furthermore, the IP address—" "Objection," Pierce interrupted, slamming her hand flat on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "Is the defense attempting to qualify this teenager as a cybersecurity expert? He dropped out of college, Your Honor. He has no degrees, no certifications, and absolutely no standing to interpret digital forensics in a court of law. This is a desperate, pathetic attempt to confuse the jury with technical jargon he likely found on a Reddit forum." Laughter rippled through the gallery. Even a few jurors smiled. Sarah Cross put her face in her hands, shoulders shaking silently. Elijah's face burned with humiliation, but he knew. The mathematics of those timestamps were indisputable. The transfers had been initiated from a secondary terminal on the 4th floor of the municipal building, a floor Sarah didn't even have keycard access to. But without recognized credentials, the court wouldn't let him say so. "Order," Judge Harrison said, banging his gavel. "Ms. Pierce, keep the commentary professional. However, Mr. Cross, the prosecution is correct. You are not a recognized expert. I cannot allow you to testify on the validity of the metadata. The motion to suppress is denied. But, Your Honor, Elijah pleaded, gripping the podium, if you just look at the raw data. I said denied, Mr. Cross, Harrison barked. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. I told you from the beginning this was a mistake. You are sinking your mother's case. Pierce walked back to the prosecution table, a triumphant smirk on her lips. As she passed him, she leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for him. You should have taken the plea deal, kid. Tomorrow I rest my case, and by Friday your mom is going to be in a holding cell. Go home. You're out of your league. Elijah stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the crushing weight of impending defeat. The system was rigged. It didn't matter how hard he'd studied or how many statutes he'd memorized. The rules, it seemed, were designed to protect the powerful and discard everyone else. As court adjourned, Elijah packed his battered briefcase in silence. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. Instead, a cold, diamond-hard resolve settled into his chest. Pierce believed she'd beaten him with the rules, but she'd forgotten one crucial thing. Elijah didn't just read the rules. He understood the architecture beneath them. And that night, he was going to find the structural flaw that would bring her entire case crashing down. Rain battered the cracked window of the library basement. It was 3 a.m, and the trial was set to resume in exactly 6 hours. Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a fortress of legal encyclopedias, printed case files, and thousands of pages of discovery documents. His eyes were bloodshot, his mind running on a dangerous mixture of black coffee and pure, unfiltered adrenaline. He knew he had to change his strategy entirely. Fighting Dana Pierce on procedural grounds was like trying to outswim a shark in its own tank. She knew the modern courtroom too well, every objection, every loophole, every trick a judge would allow. To beat her, he needed to go somewhere she wouldn't expect, deep into the foundational bedrock of constitutional law, past the surface-level statutes and into the principles underneath them. He started over. Every piece of paper, every transcript, every scrap of evidence, reread from the beginning. He already knew the digital logs were faked. He just couldn't prove it without an expert witness the court refused to recognize. So instead, he set out to prove that the prosecution itself was legally invalid. The breakthrough came at 4:15 a.m. He was reading through the city's civil forfeiture statutes, the same laws Pierce was using to simultaneously seize Sarah's home while prosecuting her, when he cross-referenced them with the landmark Supreme Court case, Timms versus Indiana, 2019. The Timms ruling had unanimously held that the Eighth Amendment's protection against excessive fines is incorporated against the states through the 14th Amendment. Pierce had already seized his mother's bank accounts and their small family home before a guilty verdict had even been rendered, claiming it was the proceeds of a crime. But Elijah didn't stop there. He dug into the specific municipal ordinance Pierce had used to authorize the seizure, Ordinance 409. Then he saw it. The fatal flaw, the arrogance of Dana Pierce laid bare in black and white ink. Pierce was so confident, so accustomed to bulldozing overworked public defenders that she'd gotten sloppy. In her rush to freeze Sarah's assets and cripple her defense, Pierce had filed the asset forfeiture under a specific municipal code that required a mandatory 48-hour judicial review by a federal magistrate, because the funds involved a federal grant. Pierce hadn't done that. Instead, she'd bypassed the federal review entirely, using a friendly local judge to rubber stamp the seizure, but it got worse, much worse. Elijah opened the Brady disclosure file. Under the landmark Supreme Court ruling Brady versus Maryland, prosecutors are legally required to turn over any exculpatory evidence, evidence that might exonerate the defendant, to the defense. Elijah stared again at the metadata from the server logs he hadn't been allowed to introduce. He hadn't just subpoenaed the logs themselves, he'd subpoenaed the IT department's internal communications about those logs. Buried on page 4,200 of a seemingly irrelevant email dump was a message from the city's lead IT technician to Dana Pierce, dated 3 weeks before the trial began. It read that an audit of the fourth-floor terminal had uncovered a remote access Trojan installed on the machine. and that the IP address responsible for the fraudulent transfers had actually been routed through an offshore server, bouncing through the municipal network. Sarah Cross's credentials had been spoofed. A diagnostic report was attached. Elijah stopped breathing for a moment. His heart pounded against his ribs. Dana Pierce had known. She'd known all along that Sarah was innocent. She'd received absolute, undeniable proof of a cyber attack, and she'd buried it. She deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence to secure a conviction and protect the city council from scrutiny. It was a textbook, egregious Brady violation, prosecutorial misconduct of the highest order, a felony. But Elijah knew that simply walking into court and waving the email around wouldn't work. Pierce would object, claim it was a draft, call it inadmissible. He needed to trap her, to lock her into a lie, on the record, in front of the judge and the jury, and only then drop the guillotine. He spent the next 3 hours drafting a precise, devastating legal strategy. He wasn't just going to save his mother anymore. He was going to use the exact same laws Pierce had wielded to oppress people and turn them against her entirely, setting a legal precedent that would echo through the state long after this trial ended. When the sun rose over Chicago, Elijah stood up, changed his shirt, and washed his face in the library bathroom. Looking at himself in the mirror, the frightened, stuttering boy from the first 4 days was gone. In his eyes now was the cold, calculating precision of someone who had already seen checkmate 3 moves ahead. Courtroom 302 was packed. Word had spread through the courthouse about the kid lawyer getting destroyed by the legendary Dana Pierce, and law students, off-duty clerks, and local reporters filled the gallery, eager to watch what they assumed would be the final slaughter. Sarah Cross sat pale and defeated at the defense table. She reached over and squeezed her son's hand. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "You did your best. I'm so proud of you." Elijah squeezed back, his grip firm. "I'm not done, Mom. Just watch." Judge Harrison took the bench. "Court is in session. The prosecution has rested. Mr. Cross, does the defense have any final witnesses or evidence before we move to closing arguments? And I remind you, I will not tolerate any more procedural deviations." Elijah stood. No notes, no legal pads, just a voice that suddenly carried a deep, resonant authority that silenced every murmur in the gallery. "Your Honor," he began, his articulation flawless. "The defense calls its final witness." Pierce rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Who is it this time? The neighborhood postman?" Elijah turned and locked eyes with her. "The defense calls lead prosecutor Dana Pierce to the stand." A collective gasp swept the courtroom. The bailiff dropped his pen. Judge Harrison leaned forward, eyes wide. "Mr. Cross," the judge stammered, "you cannot call the prosecuting attorney as a witness. It's highly irregular, almost entirely prohibited under the rules of professional conduct." "Objection!" Pierce shouted, her face flushing with sudden, uncharacteristic anger. "This is an outrage, a stunt. I demand he be held in contempt immediately." "Your Honor," Elijah countered smoothly, pulling a single sheet of paper from his pocket. "I am invoking Illinois Compiled Statute Section 115-14, which allows the calling of opposing counsel if it is established that the attorney possesses crucial, non-privileged information that cannot be obtained by any other means and is central to a claim of prosecutorial misconduct." Pierce laughed, though it sounded strained now. "Misconduct? Are you out of your mind, kid?" "I am prepared to make an offer of proof, Your Honor," Elijah continued, ignoring her. "If Ms. Pierce refuses to take the stand, I will motion for an immediate mistrial with prejudice on the grounds of a severe and intentional Brady violation regarding suppressed exculpatory evidence." The phrase hit the courtroom like a bomb. Judge Harrison studied Elijah for a long moment, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. The boy wasn't floundering. He was completely, unmistakably in control. The judge turned his gaze to Pierce, whose arrogant smirk had begun, almost imperceptibly, to falter. "Ms. Pierce," Harrison said slowly, "are you aware of any exculpatory evidence that has not been turned over to the defense?" "Absolutely not, Your Honor," Pierce lied smoothly, recovering her composure. "This boy is fishing. He has no evidence. He's trying to turn this court into a circus. Elijah pounced. Let the record show that Prosecutor Pierce has formally stated, under oath, that she is aware of no exculpatory evidence. He took 3 measured steps toward the center of the room. Your Honor, I ask the court's attention to Defense Exhibit 99. He handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. A copy went to a suddenly pale Dana Pierce. Exhibit 99 is a verified, time-stamped communication from the city's lead IT technician, Richard Vance, sent directly to Ms. Pierce's official government email address on October 12th. Inside is a diagnostic report proving the IP address used to commit the fraud was a spoofed external network utilizing a remote access Trojan. The email explicitly states that Sarah Cross's credentials were stolen. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Sarah gasped, hands flying to her mouth. That's inadmissible, Pierce shouted, her voice suddenly shrill, panic bleeding through. He hacked my emails. That's a federal crime. No, I didn't, Elijah said calmly, his voice slicing clean through the noise. I subpoenaed the IT department's communication logs regarding server maintenance. It was buried in the 5,000 pages of discovery you handed over, hoping I wouldn't read all of it. You hid the needle in the haystack, Ms. Pierce, but you forgot. I'm very, very good at finding needles. Judge Harrison read the email himself, his face darkening by the second. He looked up at Pierce, fury plain in his eyes. Ms. Pierce, is this document authentic? Pierce was visibly hyperventilating now. Your Honor, it was an inconclusive report, a draft. We didn't believe the IT technician's methodology was sound. You didn't believe it? Harrison roared, the loudest anyone in that courtroom had ever heard him. It is not your job to decide whether exculpatory evidence is sound. It is your job to turn it over to the defense. This is a textbook Brady violation. You have committed a severe ethical breach. I'm not finished, Your Honor, Elijah interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, ringing now with the cold steel of absolute certainty. Because this isn't just about the Brady violation. This is about Ordinance 409. He moved to the podium. Under the guise of this fraudulent prosecution, Ms. Pierce utilized Municipal Ordinance 409 to seize my mother's bank accounts and our family home. However, as the Supreme Court ruled in Timms versus Indiana, protection against excessive fines applies to state and local civil forfeitures as well. Seizing a family's home for a crime she knew my mother didn't commit isn't just excessive, it's a deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242. He turned, meeting the eyes of the jury, then the gallery, then finally the judge. Furthermore, Your Honor, Ordinance 409 requires a mandatory federal magistrate review within 48 hours. Ms. Pierce bypassed this, using a local judge instead, because the underlying warrant was obtained through the deliberate omission of exculpatory evidence. The seizure itself was unconstitutional. I am formally requesting not just a dismissal of all charges against Sarah Cross, but an immediate judicial order declaring Municipal Ordinance 409 unconstitutional as applied, and an immediate injunction releasing all seized assets back to my mother. The courtroom sat in stunned, breathless silence. In under 10 minutes, this 19-year-old had not only exonerated his mother, he'd exposed massive prosecutorial corruption, cited Supreme Court precedent flawlessly, and was now actively working to strike down a corrupt city ordinance that had quietly devastated low-income neighborhoods for a decade. Dana Pierce gripped the edge of her table so hard her knuckles turned white. You can't do this, she whispered, watching her entire career dissolve in real time. The law, Elijah said, echoing her own words from days earlier, is not a playground, Ms. Pierce. You treated justice like a game you could rig, but you just got checkmated. Judge Harrison sat back heavily in his leather chair. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, and the silence stretched for a full, agonizing minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the full, unmistakable weight of the state behind it. In my 30 years on this bench, he began, looking at Elijah with something like profound respect, I have never seen a more egregious abuse of prosecutorial power than what I am looking at today. And I have never seen a more brilliant deconstruction of a case by any attorney, let alone a 19-year-old representing himself. He raised his gavel. The charges against Sarah Cross are hereby dismissed with prejudice. They can never be brought again. Furthermore, the court grants the defense's motion. I am issuing an immediate injunction releasing all of Mrs. Cross's assets, and let the record reflect that this court finds the application of Municipal Ordinance 409 in this matter to be wholly unconstitutional, invalidating the city's current civil forfeiture protocols effective immediately. He turned his fierce gaze on Dana Pierce. As for you, Ms. Pierce, you are stripped of your standing in this courtroom. I am referring you immediately to the State Bar for disbarment proceedings, and I will personally be forwarding this transcript to the Department of Justice to investigate you for criminal civil rights violations under color of law. He raised the gavel high. Case dismissed. Bang. The sound of the gavel hitting wood was the sweetest sound Elijah had ever heard in his life. The courtroom exploded. Sarah burst into violent, heaving sobs, grabbing her son and burying her face in his cheap suit jacket. "You did it! My baby, you saved us!" Elijah wrapped his arms around her, the cold, calculating genius melting away to reveal, underneath, a boy who was simply, overwhelmingly relieved his mother was safe. "We're going home, Mom. We're going home." Across the aisle, the scene was entirely different. Dana Pierce stood frozen. The predator had become the prey. Two bailiffs, men who'd taken her orders without question for years, approached slowly. "Ma'am," one said, his voice devoid of any former deference, "we need you to step back from the table. The judge has ordered us to escort you to the holding area pending the federal investigator's arrival." Pierce looked at Elijah one last time. Her eyes were hollow now, stripped of every trace of arrogance. She had spent her career destroying lives for political points, wielding the law as a weapon. And in the end, it was the law itself, wielded by the boy she'd mocked, that destroyed her. She was led away in handcuffs, a final, humiliating exit from the courtroom she had once ruled without question. When Elijah and Sarah walked out through the courthouse's heavy double doors, they were met by a wall of camera flashes. The same reporters who'd come to watch a slaughter were now scrambling for an interview with the prodigy who'd broken the system wide open. "Elijah, how did you find the email?" "Mr. Cross, what are your plans now? Will you sue the city? Are you going to law school?" Elijah paused on the courthouse steps, looking out at the Chicago skyline as gray clouds finally broke, letting a single ray of sunlight hit the pavement. He looked at his mother, smiling for the first time in over a year. "I'm not interested in fame," he told the microphones, his voice calm and steady. "I just wanted to save my mother from a system that forgot what justice means. The law is meant to be a shield for the vulnerable, not a sword for the corrupt. And if the people in power forget that," he looked directly into the camera lens, "then someone has to remind them." Within weeks, the fallout proved catastrophic for the corrupt establishment that had orchestrated the whole ordeal. The DOJ's investigation into Dana Pierce uncovered a web of corruption, leading straight to the city councilman who had engineered the original fraud. Facing a decade in federal prison herself, Pierce turned state's witness. The councilman was indicted soon after. Municipal Ordinance 409 was completely rewritten, citing Cross versus City of Chicago. A new precedent that would go on to protect thousands of families from having their homes seized without due process. As for Elijah, his story went viral within days. The dean of Harvard Law School personally called him, offering a full-ride scholarship and waiving the undergraduate degree requirement entirely based on his unprecedented courtroom performance. Elijah accepted. He had walked into that courtroom, a boy in a borrowed suit, mocked, dismissed, laughed at by an entire gallery who thought they already knew how the story would end. He walked out something else entirely, a legal force the system had tried to break, and instead, without meaning to, had forged into a weapon of pure, undeniable justice. And the legal world, quietly and permanently, was never quite the same again.